Hey, good morning, Fannin. How's it going today? It's Tuesday, April 14th, coming out of Easter. It was a great weekend. Great to see everybody up at the church. Just wanted to bring a word of encouragement. Today's devotional. You know, sometimes coming out of Easter, it had a big build up for it. We can feel a little bit let down. So I wanted to bring up the festival that the Jews would have gone into immediately after the Passover. Now, we see the Passover, of course, fulfilled in Jesus, but the Jews would have gone into the next festival, which was what they call the Feast of Weeks. And that would last 49 days and then end with the festival of Pentecost. So what was the Feast of Weeks? First, well, two things that God fulfills in Jesus. Also, so what they would be celebrating would also be called the Feast of First Fruits, was the idea of their wheat harvest coming in for the spring, and also their first fruits that would have been grown. And they would present that to God. Well, we see Jesus as that idea. First of all, he is the first fruits. He's offered up to God as God's Son as the first fruit. And then we also see him fulfilled as Jesus as the bread of life. So this was the wheat harvest, which would be used to make bread. So and once again, you just see God fulfilling all these little bitty things that just continue to build up your faith. Now, like I said, this is 49 days, and then it ends on the 50th day. And that was the celebration of the Pentecost, which was tied to Exodus 19 and 20. This is where God comes down in fire on the mountain. Moses goes up to the mountain and God gives him the law. So in the Old Testament, the celebration of Pentecost had to do with the giving of the law. In the New Testament, we see it fulfilled. God doesn't come down in fire on the mountain. Instead, God gives us the Holy Spirit. And what we see that signifies that is the tongues of fire on the apostles above their heads. Excuse me. So you see this Pentecost fulfilled in the New Testament with the coming of the Holy Spirit and the beginning of the church. And one last little detail there. Over in the Old Testament in Exodus, you saw that when Moses came down from the mountains, you have the golden calf incident. And, God is angry. Moses calls for who would defend God. The Levites come to his side, and they kill 3,000 of the Jewish people in the book of Exodus as a penalty for what had happened with the golden calf. We see that balanced out over on Pentecost Day when Peter gives that first sermon in Acts 2, I believe. And how many are saved? Well, 3,000. So once again, just a little detail that just shows how thorough God is. It just builds up our belief in him. So, kind of the other thing that I like that's tied to this is when the Jews came out of captivity. So you think Nehemiah, Ezra, and all that. They began to celebrate these festivals again. And one of the things that they did is for each festival, they added a reading of the book from the Old Testament to it. And generally they added it because it would either add to the festival or it would deal with some particular aspect of it. So during the Feast of the Weeks and Pentecost, what they would read would be the book of Ruth. Now, one thing is the book of Ruth probably took place during this festival. You think about Ruth, they're harvesting the wheat and all the things that go on. So you have that aspect of it. But then the other thing they wanted to communicate was, sometimes when you're studying the law and studying theology, you can kind of get in that ivory tower mindset. It all becomes theological concepts and can lose contact with people. Well, what the book of Ruth does is it brings down these really lofty concepts of, salvation and redemption and all this, and it brings it into contact with really just day-to-day life in a small village with normal people. That's the beauty of the book of Ruth. It's our story, right? People who aren't really that important in the big picture, but their importance lies in the fact that God has called them and that they are his. So just a really neat reading. You might want to go back and read the book of Ruth during this time and just, see about these ideas, like I said, of salvation, redemption, all this type of stuff that goes on and is just set in that little setting in that little village with the book of Ruth. So that's kind of my message for you. I wanted to leave you with one other thing. Just a book, a recommendation that I think is a very life-affirming book during these times. It's one of my favorite. Read it a bunch of times. It's called A Gentleman in Moscow. So it's a Gentleman in Moscow by a guy named Amor Towles, Towles. I don't know if I'm saying his name right. But it's a story of this guy. He's a count, Alexander Rostov. And he gets arrested during the Bolshevik Revolution. back in the early 1900s, and he is sentenced to house arrest. They don't kill him like they did most of the other royalty, but they sentence him to house arrest for the rest of his life. He's a young guy, and he's got to live in this luxurious hotel. It's a really nice hotel, but imagine living life stuck in a place unable to live. Sounds somewhat familiar. You know, could be depressing, but no, this is one of the best life-affirming books I've ever read. It's just a story about a guy who has a fulfilled life and builds a life in this setting that I think that we could take some examples from. And I want to close with a quote from the book. I just think it's a great quote. He says, if a man does not master his circumstances, then he is bound to be mastered by them. So I want you to think about that. Think about the book of Ruth. Think about this situation that we find ourselves in. And remember that we are God's people, and our importance lies in that fact. So, hey, love you. Have a great day.